Welcome to Dinesh QL. My name is Dinesh Priyankara, Data Platform MVP and Business Intelligence Architect. With this video, I'm going to discuss how to execute Azure Databricks Notebook through Data Factory. But it's not going to be a standard execution. Let's see how we can pass some values to a notebook through Data Factory. And let's see how we can get some values back from notebook once the execution is completed. Okay, let me show you what I have added to this video. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on how we can pass values to Azure Databricks Notebooks through Data Factory and how we can get values back from Data Factory. So once that discussion is done, let's go through a very simple scenario and see how we can execute a notebook using Azure Data Factory by passing values and getting values back. So that's what I have planned for the demo. Okay, so let's say we have an Azure Databricks notebook. It has been implemented based on some business logic. It accepts some values, and based on those values, it continues through whatever the codes we have added, and then it completes, and then it prints a message. So let's say that's the notebook we have, and we want to get this notebook executed using Azure Data Factory. Now, in order to get a notebook executed through Azure Data Factory, all you need is to make a connection to your Azure Databricks workspace and access the notebook, access the cluster, and get it executed. In order to connect with Azure Databricks environment, you have to get a token generated from Azure Databricks, and that's what you are going to use when you create a link service within Azure Data Factory. I'll be showing you the way of generating the token from Azure Databricks and creating a link service in Azure Data Factory using that token. So once the connection is configured, you can execute the notebook. Now, how do I pass values from Azure Data Factory to my notebook? So that has to be done through input parameters. Azure Data Factory supports configuring input parameters. So you can use input parameters for passing values to notebook. But in order to pass values to notebook, you need to make sure that your notebook is prepared for accepting values. Otherwise, you have no way of passing values. So you have to add a small code to your notebook in order to capture the values coming from the Azure Data Factory and then use those values with whatever the code you have written. So it is possible. But how can I take values back from the notebook to Azure Data Factory? Can we do it through output parameters? Now, when it comes to Azure Data Factory, it does not support output parameters for Azure Databricks. So we need to find a different mechanism for passing values from notebook to Azure Data Factory. Now, notebook supports setting a value at the end of the execution. Once a value is set, if we can read that value from the Azure Data Factory, we can solve this output parameter issue. So how do you handle it? We can simply handle it through return value. Once the execution is completed, we should be able to access the value we have set in the notebook as an output and use it with our next execution that has been added to our data factory. So that's how you handle input parameters and output parameters. Now let's go into the demo and see how we can implement all of these things. So this is what I'm going to do. I have a notebook that has been configured for accessing my Azure Data Lake Gen 2. It accesses one of the paths and it gets some data process and send the process data back to the Data Lake Gen 2. Now this path is basically a hard-coded path. What I'm going to do is I'm going to execute this notebook through my Azure Data Factory, and I'll be generating the path in a sort of dynamic manner. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the current date and then form the path based on the date and send it to the Databricks. So that's going to be my input parameter. So that value will be accessed by my notebook, and then it will use that value for accessing data in the data lake, and it will use the same value for forming the output path for saving the result in the data lake. Once the execution is done, I'll be setting a value at the end of the notebook execution, and I'm trying to access, and I'm accessing that value as an output from my notebook execution, and that output will be saved in one of my Azure SQL databases. So that's what I'm going to show you as part of this demonstration. Let me open my Azure portal. Okay, this is my portal and I have already opened my Azure Databricks account and I have launched the workspace. If I go to the second tab, you can see the code I have written. So I'll quickly explain this code. What I do is I create a variable and set a value. So the value is, in this case, it is 2019-06-25, and I'm using this value for forming the path related to data lake account. So this code creates a Spark context that's for accessing the data lake Gen 2 account. I have explained this code multiple times. If you want to understand the code, please watch my previous videos. Once the Spark context is created, the next part of this code is accessing some data or accessing some files in the data lake. So as you see, I'm creating a path using this variable. I'm accessing some files in native data folder. Inside that, there's a folder called call data, and call data has some other folders based on year, month, and date. So that's what we set with this variable. This code is for setting the schema on top of data we have extracted, and once we have the data, this variable holds the data frame. And next set of codes are for performing some transformations. We'll be splitting some values in columns, and we'll be adding some new columns, and then we'll be creating a view. And once we have the view, we'll be joining that view with one of the existing tables. So you can see this is the view and this is the view. We use left outer join for getting some values from this external table, and at the end we'll be having some values with this data frame. Once we have the values, we are saving that result back to the data lake. So how do I save it? I'm going to save the result in a new folder called CDR process data, but the result will not be saved directly to this folder. It will create a set of subfolders inside this based on the path. In this case, it will create set of folders starting from this inside this 2019 folder, and then the month folder, date folder, and the result will be saved. In addition to that, you can see I'm printing a message. This message basically says whether this path was basically created or it was exist and updated. So you can see I initially set the value for the message, and I check and see whether it is exist. If it is exist, if I can access it, I'll be saying that path X is updated. If it is not, how do I check it? If the path is not exist, it will jump to the cache, and then I'll be setting the message at path created. So that's the message I set. Now let me execute this code and show you how it works. This is my data lake account. You can see I have a native data folder. If I go into this, I have call data, and inside that I have multiple folders like 2019, then months, and date. If I go to folder like 25, you can see a CSV file. That's what I'm going to access through my notebook. So let me go back to this, and I'm going to execute my notebook now. We are setting the path as 2019 June 25th. Let me execute and see whether this works. And I have already executed this path. So let me come to the third cell. So we are accessing native data, cell data 2019, 6 and 25 all files. Let me execute. Done. I'm performing some transformations. All good. We have the result. Now I'm going to execute this path. So we should see the message either as path exists updated or path created. And at the end, I should see a new folder called CDR process data 2019-6-25 in my data lake account. Let me execute this. Let me go into my Azure Data Lake account and see. So I can see the folder. So I can see it. If I execute this code again, I should see the message as path X is updated. Now what I see is path created. So let me execute this code again. Since the path is exist, I should see the message like path X is updated. So this is my notebook. Now I want to make sure that Azure Data Factory can pass a value for this, and then based on that it accesses files in my data lake, process it, and save the result back to the data lake. That's what I'm going to do. In order to pass some values from Azure Data Factory to Azure Databricks, we need to make sure notebook accepts some values. So how do I do it? I'm going to use a facility called Databricks Utilities. So Databricks Utilities are a set of functions available for working with certain things, like for example you can work with you can work with object storage efficiently, you can handle parameters, you can work with secrets. So there are multiple facilities available with utilities. So let me show you how to accept a value through this facility. Okay, I'm going to add a new cell and I'm going to use dbutils collection called widgets, and it has multiple methods. If you execute help command against this, you'll be able to see all supported functionalities. But let me straight away type text. That's the functionality I'm going to use for accepting values. So I'm going to call this value as date path, and I can set a default value. For example, I can say 2019 06 26 is the default value. Now if I execute this, you can see it makes some changes to the notebook. Let me execute this. You can see it adds a text box or input box to the notebook. The reason is we set the widget as text. If you set it as drop down, you'll be seeing a drop down. Now once this is added, I don't want this cell with my notebook. I'm going to remove it, but we need to make sure that we access this and set the dpath variable based on the value coming from this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to again use dbutils, and this time it is widgets, not the text, it is get. So get the one we created. If I execute this now, I should see 2019 06 26. So this is how you accept value. You can accept more than one value. All you have to do is, just like my previous statement, type dbutils widgets text. Okay, so let me type the code again, dbutils. This is the code. So I'm going to comment it. So if you want to have more parameters, more input values, you can use this statement for adding more values. Now input part is okay. What we have to do is set the output. Let me scroll down and go to the end. So we know that we have the message with this variable, and that's what I want to pass it to my data factory. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use dbutils again, dbutils. This time it's not widget, it's notebook, and I'm going to say exit, use this message. So what happened is, at the end of the execution, it will execute this code, and the value of this message will be passed to the calling party. In our case, it is Azure Data Factory, so we should be able to capture this. Okay, so let me execute this part and see whether it works. Yes, so no errors, everything is okay. Now let's see how we can access this notebook through Azure Data Factory and pass values and execute this notebook. Okay, let me open one of my Data Factory accounts. Click on Auth and Monitor. Go to Auth section. Right, everything is ready. I'm going to create a new pipeline for accessing my Azure Databricks notebook. But before that, I have to create a link service. So let me click on Connection and click New. Go for Compute, Azure Databricks. Click on Continue. Let's name this. I'm going to name this as link service SQL Azure Databricks test. That's the name. And from my subscription, I should be able to find my Databricks account, which is this. Okay, now Azure Data Factory can create a new cluster for this pipeline execution. But in this case, I'm not going to set it like that. I'm going to use the existing cluster. So let me select the second radio button, and I need to enter the token. So this token has to be generated from Databricks. Let me go into my Databricks environment. And how do I generate it? Click on the user icon, select user settings. You will see a button called generate new token. Let me click on it. Let's give a comment, for Azure Data Factory, and you can set the lifetime, in this case 90 days. So I'm okay with that. Click on generate, and I'm going to copy this code, go back to this and paste it. Let me go back to my Databricks environment and click on done. So let's go to Data Factory again, and if I expand this, I should see my cluster. So if you see this cluster, which means Azure Data Factory can access your Databricks environment. So let's set it. That's all. Let's click on let me click on test connect. Connection is successful, everything is okay. Let me click on create for creating this link service. Okay, that part is done. We need to have one more link service because at the end I'm going to save the status or the message coming from my notebook in one of my SQL databases. So let me create that link service as well. Click on new SQL server, which is this is Azure SQL database. Click on continue. Let me name it, and let me select the server, which is this, and the database is test database. Let me set the username and the password. Let's click on test connection. All good. Click on create. Okay, we have two link services. Now let's start with the pipeline. I'm going to add a new pipeline, and I'm going to create a variable. Let me go to the variable section and add a new variable. I'm going to name this variable as date path. It's going to be string, and this is going to be my default value. So why I need this variable? Because I'm going to use this variable for setting the current date time, and then I can pass the value of this variable for my notebook as the input parameter. Okay, so how do I change the value of this date path variable dynamically? I need to use something called set variable. So let me search for set variable, drag and drop, and this is my set variable. Let me go into variable section. I should be able to access my newly created variable. Once a variable is selected, we should see the input box for value. We are not going to hard code it. Let's use dynamic content section for getting the current date and time, format it, and the result of the format can be assigned to this variable. Now how do I get the current date time? If I scroll down and expand date function, I should be able to find a function called UTC now. So if I click on it, it is getting added to this. This returns the current date and time. But what we need is a formatted value. So how do I format the value? I can use format date time. Let me click on it. It is getting added. Open bracket, and the first parameter is UTC now. So it returns the current date time, and let's put the format. 4 wives and slash double M slash double D. Let me put everything in single quotes. All good. Set. No errors. Let me click on finish. My variable is ready with current date and time. Now the next part is accessing the notebook. So I'm going to search for notebook, drag and drop, make the connection, because that's the second step of my pipeline. Select notebook, go to the second tab of properties. We should select the link service. Since we have already created the link service, we don't need to create it again. I can simply select it. I can go to the third tab of this and look for my notebook. If I click on browse, if I go for users, my account, and this is the one I have created. Click on OK. We have set the notebook. We know that notebook has a parameter. Let me quickly go to the notebook. This is the parameter. So we need to set this parameter with our variable. Let me copy this and go back to my Data Factory pipeline. Expand base parameters, add new, set the value. And how do I set the value for this parameter? Again, click on add dynamic content. You can simply access our variable, which is this. That's all. Click on finish. Now we have set the input parameter for notebook 1. Now, how do I get the output parameter? As I told you, I want to get the output parameter, the specific message, and then I want to get it inserted to my SQL Server table. Let me quickly show you the table I have created for this. This is the database and this is the table. So this table has message ID, that's a primary key, and the identity property has been set. We don't need to worry about the value of it. And the date, again the default date has been set, and we'll be filling this column. So how do I fill this column? Using this stored procedure. If I execute the select statement against this table, the moment I don't have any records. So let's configure this with the pipeline. Let me look for stored procedures, drag and drop, make the connection, and let's configure the stored procedure. SQL account, we have already created the connection, so we can select the link service, and let's go for stored procedures. If I expand this, I should see the stored procedure. Add message is the stored procedure I have created. Import parameters. It has picked one parameter called message, and we need to make sure that this message parameter is set with the output coming from notebook. If I go back to my notebook and scroll down, this is what we have set. Now let's see how we can access this within the pipeline. So let me click on value, and I'm going to click on add dynamic content. I'm going to access my notebook. So I need to start with add an activity. Within bracket, I need to pass the activity name. So in this case, it is notebook 1. I didn't give any specific name. So it is notebook 1. It has a property called output, and output is a collection. It has another property called run output, and that's what we have to use for accessing the output coming from our notebook. Let me click on finish, and I'm going to execute this and see whether it works. But before that, let's make sure that we don't have a folder for today in Data Lake account. Let me go to my Storage Explorer, and I'm going to delete this CDR process data. Done. Okay, so let's execute. Today is 30th of April. So at the end of the execution, I should see a new folder for 30th of April 2020, and I should see a message in my SQL Server table. Let's click on debug. My pipeline is being executed. First part is okay. It just setting value to the variable. Now it is executing my notebook. Okay, execution is completed. So first activity, it set the variable value with the current date, and the second activity, pipeline executed the notebook. It sent the value, and notebook used the value for accessing the data lake, process it, and the result has been saved to data lake. Let's check the data lake and see whether the result has been saved with the relevant folder. And with the third activity, it updated the table. Actually, it inserted the record to the table. Let's see. Let's go to the data lake account and see whether a new folder has been created or not. Let me refresh. Folder has been created. Let's go into it and see whether it is the right folder. 2020 April and the 30th. I can see the output. So this part is okay. Let's query the table and see. I can see path created because path wasn't exist. Let's execute the pipeline again and see. Let me click on debug. Done. Let's go to the table and see. I can see the second record. It says path exists updated. So we are 100% sure that notebook is getting a value from our data factory. That's why it creates a relevant folder in the data lake account, and notebook is sending the value to data factory. That's why we are seeing this value in this table. So this is how you pass values to notebook and getting values back from the notebook to Azure Data Factory pipeline. That's all we have. I hope you understood the way of passing values to notebook and the way of getting values from the notebook to Azure Data Factory pipeline. If you have any question on this, please put a comment. I'll reply whenever the time permits. Thanks for watching.